South Texas, 1854. Dust. Heat so thick it bends the air. A man drives a stake into the dirt beside a creek. Santa Gertrudis, they call it. Good water, the only water for miles. That stake becomes a fence. The fence becomes a property line. The property line becomes 825,000 acres, 1,300 square miles, larger than Rhode Island, sprawling across 6 counties. They'll tell you this is a ranch, a family story, cattle, horses, cowboys, legacy. But look closer. Artesian wells drilled 500 feet into the earth, breeding programs measured in decades, tick eradication campaigns, root plows tearing through the brush, and beneath the grass, 650 oil wells pumping money back up. This isn't a ranch, it's a machine, and the brand outlived every man who built it. So what are you looking at? A piece of the frontier preserved? Or a blueprint for how private power actually works? Chapter 1. South Texas makes rules. Before there was a ranch, there was the land, and the land had rules. This is the Wild Horse Desert, mesquite and thorn scrub stretching past the horizon in every direction. Summer temperatures above 100 degrees for weeks at a time, sometimes months. Humidity that makes the air feel like something you wear, something that presses against your skin and fills your lungs with weight. And drought, not a single dry season, but years of it, rolling through without warning, turning creeks to dust and grass to memory. Nothing here is easy to keep alive. The land resists you. It punishes mistakes. It waits for weakness with the patience of something that has already outlasted everything that tried to claim it. The Spanish came and called it a desert, though it wasn't dry in the way most people imagine deserts. It was hostile in a different way, too far from anywhere, too hot in summer, too prone to cycles of flood and drought that made planning impossible. They established missions, ran cattle, drew maps. Then they left, or were pushed out, or simply faded into the next flag that flew over this territory. Mexico inherited the land and struggled with it. The Republic of Texas claimed it and barely held it. By the time the United States absorbed the region, after the Mexican-American War, the Wild Horse Desert had already buried multiple attempts at settlement. The land didn't care whose name was on the deed. The land just kept being itself. Cattle need water. In country like this, that means cattle need you to find the water, to dig for it, to pipe it, to guard it. People follow cattle, money follows people, and whoever controls where the water is, controls where everything else can go. That's the equation the land wrote before anyone showed up to claim it. Water is permission. Without it, you're just a man with paper and ambition waiting to fail. 6 counties would eventually carry pieces of this ranch: Kleberg, Kennedy, Brooks, Jim Wells, Nueces, Willacy. But in the early 1850s, those names didn't exist yet. The political boundaries were still being drawn. There were no towns to speak of, no railroad for hundreds of miles, no roads worth the word, just the brush, the heat, the thorns, and the creek, Santa Gertrudis. The Spanish had known about it, so had the people before them, the Coahuiltecans, the Karankawa, the ones whose names got lost when the maps were redrawn. Water like that doesn't stay secret. It pulls life toward it. Animals know where it is. People follow the animals, and then other people follow them, looking to take what the first ones found. Holding it would take more than a deed. It would take a system. It would take people willing to stay when others left. It would take money and labor and time measured not in seasons, but in generations. The men who came to build that system understood something the land had been teaching for centuries. In South Texas, you don't conquer the desert. You negotiate with it. You give it labor and money and time. And if you're lucky, if you're relentless, it lets you stay. Chapter 2. A Camp on the Creek. 1852. A camp appears on the banks of Santa Gertrudis Creek. Not a house, not a headquarters. A camp, temporary, improvised, the kind of thing you build when you're not sure yet whether the land will let you stay. A few structures thrown together from whatever was available. Men sleeping with weapons close, because the border was violent, and the law was distant, and the only protection that mattered was what you could provide yourself. But the water was good, clear and steady, even when the rest of the country turned to dust. And in South Texas, good water is the only argument that matters. By 1853, the paper starts. Land grants acquired from the state. Purchases from previous owners who had tried and failed, or who saw opportunity in selling to someone with deeper pockets and more patience. 15,500 acres here, 53,000 acres there, parcels accumulated like pieces of a puzzle, each one chosen for a reason. The logic was simple, and it was ruthless. Buy what touches the water first, then expand outward. If you own the creek, the dry land around it becomes leverage. Nobody else can use it without you. Nobody else can run cattle through it without your permission. The worthless acres become valuable the moment you control what makes them livable. This is how empires begin. Not with conquest, at least not the kind you read about in history books. With position. One creek, claimed early, becomes the center of gravity for everything that follows. Every subsequent purchase expands the perimeter. Every new fence extends the reach. And before anyone realizes what's happening, the map has been redrawn around a single point of control. But why this scale? Why not just enough land to run cattle and make a living? Why 800,000 acres instead of 8,000? There's a question underneath the founding story that rarely gets asked. What were these men trying to prove? What wound were they trying to heal? What fear were they trying to outrun? In South Texas in the 1850s, land meant survival. But at this scale, it meant something more. It meant permanence. It meant power that couldn't be taken away by a bad season or a shifting market. It meant building something so large that it would outlast the men who built it, a kind of immortality purchased acre by acre, a hedge against the knowledge that men die, but land endures. Maybe that's the wound at the center of every empire, the fear of being forgotten, the need to matter beyond a single lifetime, the drive to build something that will still be standing when everyone who remembers you is gone. But here's what the founding story rarely mentions. The land wasn't empty. It had been ranched before by Mexican landowners whose grants predated Texas statehood. It had been fought over during the wars that shifted the border back and forth. It had been home to people whose claims were older than any piece of paper, indigenous groups pushed out by disease and violence, and the relentless pressure of newcomers who didn't recognize their right to exist. Spain, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the United States, 4 flags in 40 years, each one rewriting who owned what. Each transition created winners and losers. Each new government validated some claims and invalidated others. The land that became available for purchase in the 1850s was available because someone else had lost it. When you buy land with a history like that, you're not just buying dirt. You're buying someone else's loss, someone else's displacement, someone else's failed attempt at the same thing you're trying. The deed in your hand is clean. The history beneath it isn't. The creek didn't care. The creek just kept running. It had been running before the Spanish came, before the missions were built, before anyone thought to draw a line on a map and call it property. It would keep running after all of them were gone. And around it, fence by fence, purchase by purchase, something permanent began to take shape. Not because the land allowed it, but because the people who came were willing to outlast everyone who couldn't. They had capital. They had connections. They had the backing of a legal system that recognized their claims and dismissed the claims of those who came before. Was that resilience? Or was it something else, something closer to erasure, happening so slowly it looked like progress? The ranch doesn't answer that question. It just keeps running, like the creek. Chapter 3. Los Kineos. A ranch this size doesn't run on founders, it runs on hands. Sometime in the 1850s, the exact year is disputed, the details softened by time and retelling, a drought hit the village of Cruilas, across the border in Tamaulipas, Mexico. Not an ordinary dry spell, the kind of drought that empties towns, that kills livestock and withers crops and leaves people with a choice between leaving and dying. Families packed what they could carry. They walked north, across a border that existed on maps, but meant little in the brush country. They were looking for water, looking for work, looking for a way to survive that didn't involve watching their children starve. They found the ranch, and the ranch found them. These families became Los Kineos, the king's people. Not employees in the modern sense of the word. Something older, something more complicated, something that doesn't translate cleanly into the language of contracts and wages and human resources departments. They built the fences. Miles and miles of fence, post by post, wire by wire, across terrain that fought every step of the way. They worked the cattle, driving herds through brush so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, roping and branding and doctoring animals in heat that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. They maintained the wells, climbing down into the earth to repair pumps and pipes that the whole operation depended on. They broke the horses. They buried the dead. They raised children who would do the same work on the same land for the same brand. Generation after generation, the same families, the same land, the same running W. The official history calls this loyalty, a partnership, a shared legacy stretching across more than a century and a half. The ranch publications celebrate the Kineos as family, as essential to the King Ranch story as the founders themselves. And maybe it was. Maybe it is. Relationships that last 170 years aren't simple. They contain multitudes. They carry genuine affection alongside genuine inequality. People can be proud of their work and exploited by the system that employs them at the same time. These things aren't mutually exclusive. But loyalty that begins with desperation looks different than loyalty that begins with choice. When your family arrives during a drought with nothing and the ranch offers water and work and a place to stay, what are you really agreeing to? When your options are starvation or service, is the service freely given? What are your children agreeing to, born into a relationship they never chose? Your grandchildren? Your great-grandchildren? The line between partnership and dependency gets blurry when you look at it across generations. It gets blurrier still when the partners have such different amounts of power. What's undeniable is the work, the invisible labor that made the visible empire possible. Every mile of fence had to be dug, strung, and maintained, and there are thousands of miles of fence. Every windmill had to be checked, repaired, rebuilt when it broke. Every sick calf had to be found in 800,000 acres of brush, doctored, and either saved or put down. Every horse had to be trained by someone who understood that a green colt in a South Texas summer can kill a man if he makes one wrong move. The founders get the statues, the Kineos got the work, and the ranch, the machine, needed both to run. It needed the capital and the vision and the political connections that the founders provided, and it needed the labor and the skill and the willingness to stay that the Kineos provided. Without either half, the whole thing would have collapsed. Was this a family, or was it a system dressed in the language of family? The answer probably depends on which side of the ledger your ancestors appeared on. What's certain is that the relationship endured through economic depressions, through world wars, through the transformation of ranching from frontier adventure to industrial agriculture. The same families kept showing up, generation after generation, their knowledge passed down like an inheritance, their skills refined over lifetimes. By the 20th century, Los Kineños' expertise was irreplaceable. These were not interchangeable workers. They were specialists, carrying knowledge that could not be learned from books, could not be acquired in a season, could not be replaced if it was lost. The machine needed them, and they, for better or worse, needed the machine. Chapter 4. A River Under the Ranch. The creek was a start. But a creek can dry up. A creek can be shared, its water rights contested, its flow diverted by neighbors upstream. A creek isn't control, it's just advantage. Control came from below. Sometime in the late 19th century, the ranch began drilling. Not for oil, that would come later, and it would change everything. They were drilling for water, artesian water, trapped in underground aquifers, pressurized by the weight of the rock above it, waiting to be released. The geology of South Texas had created something remarkable. Layers of porous rock, saturated with water, sealed beneath impermeable formations. Drill through the cap, and the pressure pushes the water up. No pump needed. The earth does the work. The numbers are hard to believe. One documented well near the ranch headquarters went down about 530 feet. When the drill bit penetrated the aquifer, the water didn't just seep up through the hole. It rose, pushed by underground pressure, climbing roughly 25 feet above the surface. A geyser that didn't stop. That single well flowed at about 250 gallons per minute. No electricity required. No maintenance beyond keeping the pipe clear, just water pushing itself up out of the ground, pouring into a reservoir, waiting to be distributed. 250 gallons a minute, 15,000 gallons an hour, 360,000 gallons a day, from one well, and the ranch would eventually have dozens. This changed everything. It rewrote the rules that the Wild Horse Desert had enforced for millennia. Suddenly, cattle didn't have to follow the creek. They could graze wherever the pipes reached. Pastures that were worthless, too far from surface water to support a herd for more than a few days, became usable year-round. The ranch could expand in directions that had been impossible before, as long as the drills kept finding water beneath the sand. Water networks spread across the ranch like a circulatory system. Wells feeding reservoirs, reservoirs feeding pipelines, pipelines feeding troughs in pastures that had never had reliable water before. The infrastructure was massive, and it was invisible, buried underground, running beneath the grass, making possible an operation that looked natural but was anything but. But engineering has a price. It always does. Once you build a system that depends on pumped water, you've created a new kind of fragility. Wells need maintenance, pipes corrode, reservoirs silt up. The infrastructure that freed you from dependence on surface water now chains you to constant upkeep. Stop maintaining the system for a season, and it starts to fail. Stop for a year, and the desert starts taking back what you thought you'd won. And aquifers aren't infinite. They recharge slowly over decades, sometimes centuries. The water down there accumulated over geological time, dripping through rock formations, grain by grain. Every gallon pulled up is a withdrawal from a bank account that took thousands of years to fill. They were thinking about cattle, about survival, about the immediate problem of keeping animals alive in a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. The water network became the ranch's circulatory system. Wells connected to reservoirs, reservoirs connected to pipelines, pipelines feeding troughs in pastures miles from any natural water source. Each of the 4 divisions, Santa Gertrudis, Laureles, Norias, Encino, developed its own water infrastructure, its own web of pipes and tanks and windmills, all maintained by workers who understood that a broken pump in August could kill cattle by the dozens. The infrastructure was invisible from the surface. You could ride across the ranch and see nothing but grass and brush and cattle, never knowing that beneath your feet ran miles of pipe, carrying water from aquifers that had taken geological ages to fill. The machine was hidden. The machine was everywhere. But the water was never really free. The bill just hadn't come due yet. Chapter 5. The Invisible Enemy. You can fence land. You can pipe water. You can hire workers and buy cattle and build corrals and lay out pastures according to the most scientific principles available. But you can't fence out a tick. The cattle fever tick, Rhipicephalus annulatus, if you want the Latin, was the invisible killer of the 19th century cattle industry. Smaller than a fingernail, brown and flat until it fed, then swollen with blood. Nearly impossible to spot in a herd of 1,000 animals. Nearly impossible to eliminate once it established itself in a pasture. And carrying in its saliva a parasite that could wipe out entire operations in a single season. Texas fever, they called the disease it spread. Bovine babesiosis, technically a protozoan that attacked red blood cells, destroying them faster than the animal's body could replace them. Infected cattle ran high fevers, stopped eating, turned yellow from the inside out as their organs failed. Mortality rates in naive herds, animals that had never been exposed before, could hit 90%. And here's the cruel irony. Texas cattle had developed partial resistance over generations of exposure. They could carry the ticks, host the parasites, show few symptoms, and survive. They were reservoirs, walking incubators for a disease they'd learned to tolerate. But when they were driven north to railheads in Kansas, to markets in Missouri, to feedlots across the Midwest, they brought the fever with them. Northern cattle, with no resistance, died by the thousands. Entire regions lost their herds. Ranchers faced ruin through no fault of their own, killed by an enemy they couldn't see, carried by animals that looked perfectly healthy. By the 80s, entire states had banned Texas cattle. Quarantine lines were drawn across maps, dividing the country into zones, infected and clean, safe and dangerous. The southern cattle industry was trapped behind an invisible wall of disease, unable to access the markets that made ranching profitable. Northern buyers wouldn't touch Texas beef. Northern railroads wouldn't carry Texas cattle. The tick had done what geography couldn't. It had isolated an entire region. The solution wasn't medicine. There was no medicine that could cure Texas fever or kill the tick reliably. Vaccines were decades away. Treatments were ineffective. The only option was prevention, breaking the tick's life cycle before it could spread. The solution was engineering, dipping vats. Long concrete troughs, built into the ground, filled with arsenical solution, poison strong enough to kill the ticks, but not quite strong enough to kill the cattle. Every animal on the ranch had to be driven through, submerged up to the neck, soaked in the chemical bath until every parasite on its hide was dead. King Ranch installed its first vats in 1891. The operation became routine, brutal, and endless. Round up the herd, drive them to the vat, force them through the trough, release them to the pasture. Wait 14 to 21 days, the tick's life cycle. Do it again, and again, and again. Thousands of animals, hundreds of cycles, year after year after year. This is the part of ranching nobody romanticizes. No sunsets, no open range, no cowboy songs around the campfire, just men standing in chemical fumes, pushing cattle through poison troughs, trying to kill something too small to see. Workers who went home with arsenical burns on their arms. Animals that panicked and drowned in the vats. Cattle that fought the process and had to be forced through one by one, while men with poles kept them moving. The endless, grinding labor of fighting an enemy that kept coming back no matter how many times you thought you'd won. But it worked. Slowly, painfully, the fever tick was pushed back. By the early 20th century, the ranch was cooperating with federal animal health programs, part of a nationwide campaign to eradicate the pest entirely. The systematic approach proved that what seemed impossible, eliminating a parasite from millions of acres of brushland, could be done with enough money, enough labor, and enough time. The tick never completely disappeared. It still lurks along the border, still requires constant vigilance, still breaks out occasionally and has to be beaten back. But the systematic approach proved something important about King Ranch. A ranch this size couldn't afford to be romantic about nature. Every threat had to be identified, measured, and neutralized. Every variable had to be controlled. The cattle weren't livestock anymore. They were inventory, and inventory has to be protected. Chapter 6. Breeding a Climate-Proof Cow. The problem was biological, and it had been there from the beginning. European cattle, Herefords, Shorthorns, Angus, the breeds that dominated American ranching, produced excellent beef. Tender, well-marbled, exactly what the market wanted. They had been refined over centuries of breeding in the cool, wet climates of Britain and northern Europe. But they suffered in South Texas. The heat drained them. They could not regulate their body temperature the way they needed to, so they spent the summer panting in whatever shade they could find, losing weight instead of gaining it. The humidity bred parasites in their thin hides. The brush tore their skin. They got sick at rates that made the economics nearly impossible. Brahman cattle, the humped breeds from India with their loose skin and drooping ears, thrived in the heat. Evolution had designed them for it. They had sweat glands that actually worked, loose skin that twitched off flies and gave parasites nothing to grip, a tolerance for conditions that killed their European cousins. They could gain weight through a South Texas summer while Herefords withered. But their meat was tougher, less marbled, harder to sell at premium prices. The market did not want Brahman beef. The market wanted tender steaks from breeds that could not survive the climate that produced them. The solution was obvious. The execution took decades. King Ranch began crossing Brahman bulls with shorthorn cows in the early 20th century. Not random breeding, not just throwing animals together and hoping for the best. Selection. Rigorous, documented, scientific selection. Breeding the best to the best, culling the rest, tracking every cross in ledgers that would grow to fill entire rooms. The target ratio, according to ranch records, was 5/8 Shorthorn, 3/8 Brahman. Enough European blood for beef quality. Enough Brahman blood to handle the climate. a formula like a recipe that could be repeated and refined across generations. In 1920, a calf was born that seemed to embody the formula perfectly. Cherry red coat, heavy muscling, the heat tolerance of his Brahmin ancestors and the beef conformation of his shorthorn side. They called him Monkey, nobody remembers why, and he became the foundation sire, the genetic anchor for everything that followed. 20 years of careful breeding followed. Monkey's offspring were tested, measured, evaluated against a checklist of traits that defined what a king ranch animal should be. The best were kept and bred. The rest were culled, sold off, slaughtered, removed from the gene pool. Generation after generation, the ranch shaped the herd like a sculptor shapes clay, except the medium was DNA, and the timeline was measured in lifetimes. In 1940, the United States Department of Agriculture officially recognized the result. Santa Gertrudis, named for the creek where it all started. The first beef breed ever developed in the United States. A new kind of animal, engineered from existing parts, designed to thrive where nothing else could. The recognition was more than a certificate. It was validation, proof that the systematic approach worked, that science applied to ranching could produce results that mattered, that King Ranch wasn't just big, it was innovative. That's how the ranch tells the story. Pioneer genetics, American innovation. A triumph of science over nature, of human will over environmental limitation. And it was a triumph, by certain measures. The Santa Gertrudis could survive where other cattle failed. It opened South Texas to large-scale beef production in ways that hadn't been possible before. The breed spread across the world, to Australia, to Africa, to South America, anywhere the climate was too harsh for European stock. The work didn't stop in 1940. Breeding programs continued, refining the formula, chasing incremental improvements. By 1994, the ranch had developed another cross, Santa Cruz, they called it, incorporating additional genetics, pushing the experiment into its second century. But there's another way to see it. Decades of controlled reproduction. Thousands of animals bred, evaluated, and discarded based on how well they fit a formula written in a ledger. The commodification of life itself stretched across generations. Animals reduced to variables. Genetics reduced to engineering problems. Living creatures treated as raw material for an industrial process. The cattle didn't choose to be experiments. They were born, measured, and either kept or killed based on criteria they couldn't understand. Was this innovation? Or was it something colder, biology bent to economics, life reduced to output, nature rewritten to serve the balance sheet? The answer probably depends on whether you're holding the breeding records or standing in the chute. Chapter 7. Fences and Brush Wars. The myth says open range. The reality was wire. By the 1930s, King Ranch was systematically enclosing its territory with net wire fencing, not the simple barbed wire of earlier decades, but tight-woven mesh that could contain cattle, exclude predators, and define property in a way that left no ambiguity. The scale is hard to imagine. 825,000 acres divided into 4 major divisions. Santa Gertrudis, the original nucleus around the creek where the headquarters still stands. Laureles to the east, stretching toward the coast. Norias to the south, deep in the brush country where the mesquite grows thickest. Encino, the western division, bordering the dry country where water matters most. Each division operates almost as its own ranch. Each has its own headquarters, its own foreman, its own workforce, its own herd of cattle and string of horses. Each answers to the central management, but handles its own day-to-day operations, the roundups, The branding, the fence repairs, the endless work of keeping animals alive in country that doesn't want them there. Within those divisions, hundreds of individual pastures, each one fenced, each one mapped and named, each one assigned a carrying capacity based on soil type, water access, and forage quality. Each one slotted into a rotation system designed to let the grass recover between grazing cycles. This wasn't ranching as the movies show it, riders pushing cattle across open prairie, free to roam wherever the grass led. This was land management, industrial, calculated, precise. Every pasture had a schedule, every gate had a reason. Every fence line represented decisions made in offices based on data collected over decades, and the fences were only half the battle. The brush was winning. Mesquite, huisac, blackbrush, prickly pear, catclaw, retama, the native vegetation of South Texas, didn't care about property lines. It spread wherever overgrazing weakened the grass, wherever fire suppression let seedlings survive, wherever the natural balance had been disrupted by a century of cattle ranching. Brush was the enemy. It sheltered predators that killed calves. It blocked sight lines that cowboys needed to work cattle. It hid animals that needed to be found. Worst of all, it competed with grass, stealing water and nutrients from the forage that kept the whole operation alive. Every acre lost to brush was an acre that couldn't support cattle. And the brush was relentless, creeping outward year after year, reclaiming pastures that had been cleared a generation before. In 1935, the ranch began deploying root plows, massive blades dragged behind crawler tractors, designed to cut through the soil at a depth of 12 to 18 inches, severing mesquite roots and tearing entire plants out of the ground. The scale was industrial. Thousands of acres, cleared and reseeded with improved grasses that could support higher stocking rates. The brush was burned, piled, or left to rot. The land was reshaped to serve the operation's needs. 3 years later, in 1938, the ranch introduced mineral and vitamin supplements to its feeding program, another layer of optimization, squeezing more productivity from the same land. Cattle that got the right nutrients gained weight faster, bred more reliably, survived conditions that would have killed their grandparents. Wire, plows, supplements, schedules, record-keeping. The wild horse desert was being converted into a machine, every input measured, every output tracked. The romance of the frontier giving way to the logic of the factory. Was this progress? The land certainly became more productive. Carrying capacity increased. Profits stabilized. The operation became sustainable in a way that frontier ranching never could be. But productivity isn't the same as health. The native brush, for all its problems, had evolved over millennia to survive in this climate. It held soil in place. It provided habitat for wildlife. It was part of a system that balanced itself without human intervention. The grasses that replaced it needed constant intervention to stay ahead of the desert that wanted to reclaim them. The cleared pastures required re-clearing over and over, or the mesquite would return. The fences needed endless maintenance. The supplements had to be purchased and distributed every season. Every system that creates control also creates dependency. The ranch had conquered the brush, but now it had to keep conquering every season forever, or watch the desert take back what was never really surrendered. Chapter 8. Oil Under the Grass. Here's the thing about cattle. They're a terrible business. Prices swing with markets you can't control. A glut of beef in Chicago can wipe out your profit margin in South Texas. A drought in Montana can raise prices one year and collapse them the next when everyone sells at once. The cycles are brutal and unpredictable, driven by weather patterns and consumer preferences and international trade policies that no rancher can influence. Droughts kill inventory you can't insure. A bad summer can force you to sell animals at the worst possible time, taking losses just to reduce the herd to something the land can support. Disease can wipe out years of breeding in a single season. The margins are thin, even in good years, and the good years never last. A ranch the size of King Ranch had survived on cattle for nearly a century. But survival isn't the same as security. Every drought was a crisis. Every market crash was a reckoning. The operation was always one bad year away from having to sell land, liquidate herds, contract back toward something more manageable. Then the ground paid them twice. 1939. The first oil well on King Ranch land comes in. Not the biggest strike in Texas history, not a gusher that made headlines across the country, but significant, valuable, and just the beginning. The geology that had trapped artesian water also trapped hydrocarbons. The same rock formations that made the ranch's water system possible had been accumulating oil and gas for millions of years, sealed beneath the surface, waiting for someone to drill deep enough to find it. By 1947, there were 390 producing oil wells scattered across the ranch. By 1953, that number had grown to 650 oil and gas wells, pumping money out of the same ground the cattle walked. Think about what that means. For nearly 100 years, the ranch had been a cattle operation that happened to sit on 800,000 acres. Every decision had been about livestock, breeding, grazing, disease control, market access. The land existed to support the animals. The animals existed to generate revenue. The whole enterprise balanced on beef prices and rainfall. After 1939, it was an oil operation that happened to run cattle. The economics flipped completely. Suddenly, the beef herd wasn't the primary revenue stream. It was a side business, a legacy operation, a piece of the brand identity that no longer had to carry the weight of paying for itself. Oil changed what the ranch could afford to be. The breeding programs could continue without pressure to turn a quick profit. Experimental crosses that might take decades to pay off could be funded without risking the core business. A bull that didn't produce until his grandchildren were evaluated? Fine. The oil would cover the cost of waiting. The conservation efforts could expand without justifying themselves on a spreadsheet. Hire a wildlife biologist? Why not? Protect quail habitat, even when it reduced grazing capacity. The numbers worked now. The prestige projects, the racehorses, the hunting operations, the hospitality ventures could be funded as brand investments rather than profit centers. Things that made the ranch famous didn't need to make the ranch money. They just needed to burnish the image, enhance the reputation, keep the running W visible in places where visibility translated to influence. The pump jacks standing in the pastures became the real foundation. The cattle became the scenery. This isn't a criticism. It's just the truth of how large ranches survive in modern America. The ones that lasted into the 21st century almost all found something else under the soil, oil, gas, minerals, water rights that could be leased. The ones that didn't get carved up and sold, their acreage subdivided into ranchettes and housing developments and strip malls. But it does complicate the mythology. When you see the running W, you're supposed to think of cattle and cowboys and the frontier spirit. You're not supposed to think about petroleum royalties and mineral leases and the geological luck of sitting on the right formation at the right time. The brand tells one story. The balance sheet tells another. Chapter 9. Building a Town. A ranch this powerful doesn't stay inside its fences. Look at a map of South Texas. Find Kleberg County. Find the town at its center, Kingsville. The name isn't a coincidence. In the early 20th century, the ranch didn't just employ people, it anchored an entire region. Workers needed places to live. Their families needed schools, churches, stores. The operation needed supplies, services, infrastructure that couldn't exist in the middle of 800,000 acres of brush. So a town grew up at the edge of the ranch, not by accident, not through the organic drift of settlement, by design shaped by the same forces that shaped everything else in this part of Texas. The railroad came through because the ranch made it worthwhile. The businesses opened because ranch workers and ranch money created demand. The county was organized and named for a family connected to the operation. The relationship between the town and the ranch wasn't employer and community. It was something closer to symbiosis, where the boundaries blurred until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. When you control that much land, that many jobs, that much money in a single region, you become more than a business. You become the economy. You become the reason anything else exists. Your interests and the community's interests start to merge, but at least that's how it looks from the outside. From the inside, the picture is more complicated. Towns that depend on a single employer are vulnerable in ways that diversified economies aren't. When the ranch does well, everyone does well. When the ranch struggles, but when the ranch decides it needs fewer workers, or different workers, or workers in a different place, the whole community feels it. And there's another kind of power that comes with this arrangement. Political power. The kind that shapes county commissions and school boards and water districts, the kind that influences which roads get built and which regulations get enforced, the kind that makes it very difficult to do anything in the region that the ranch doesn't approve of. None of this is unique to King Ranch. Company towns have existed throughout American history, mill towns, mining towns, factory towns. Places where a single enterprise became so dominant that the distinction between private interest and public good collapsed entirely. What's different about King Ranch is the longevity. The mill towns closed when the mills moved overseas. The mining towns emptied when the ore ran out. But the ranch is still there, still operating, still the gravitational center of a region that has never known anything else. Generations have grown up with the ranch as the backdrop to their lives. Their grandparents worked there, or supplied it, or taught school to the children of people who did. The running W isn't just a brand in this part of Texas, it's part of the landscape, as natural as the mesquite, as permanent as the heat. That kind of permanence creates its own gravity. Young people who leave for college often come back because the ranch economy is the only economy they know, the only one that makes sense in this corner of the world. The alternatives are distant: Houston, San Antonio, somewhere else entirely. The ranch is here. The ranch has always been here. When you've been the biggest thing in the room for 170 years, you stop being one force among many. You become the room itself, and everyone inside it learns to arrange themselves around you. Chapter 10. Assault and the Triple Crown. March 26, 1943. A colt is born at King Ranch. Nothing special about the day. Nothing special about the foal at first glance. Just another entry in the breeding ledgers, another animal to be raised and evaluated and either kept or sold. The ranch had hundreds of horses. This was one more. Then the accident. A surveyor's stake left in the ground, somewhere it shouldn't have been. The colt stepped on it wrong or caught his foot against it. The details vary depending on who tells the story. What's certain is the result. The hoof split. The injury healed badly, leaving the foot permanently deformed. Clubbed, they said. A horse with a clubfoot wasn't supposed to be a racehorse. A horse with a clubfoot was supposed to be culled or sold cheap or retired to some lesser purpose. But someone saw something. Someone looked at that damaged colt and saw potential that the injury couldn't erase. Someone decided to train him anyway. They named him Assault. In 1946, Assault won the Kentucky Derby, then the Preakness Stakes, then the Belmont Stakes, the Triple Crown. The club-footed colt from a South Texas cattle ranch had done what only 8 horses had done before him, what only 5 have done in the 80 years since. The story writes itself. The underdog, the injury, the triumph over adversity. Assault became more than a horse. He became a narrative, a symbol, proof that obstacles could be overcome with enough heart and enough will. And King Ranch knew exactly what to do with a story like that. Assault became proof. Proof that the ranch's breeding programs worked. Proof that King Ranch didn't just raise cattle, it raised champions. Proof that the running W meant excellence, not just in livestock, but in anything it touched. But here's the part the story usually skips. Assault wasn't a miracle. He was a product. The same systematic approach that created the Santa Gertrudis cattle created the horse program. Bloodlines tracked through generations, performance measured and recorded, winners bred to winners with the failures quietly removed from the breeding pool. The injury made for a good story, but the genetics were engineered long before that surveyor's stake entered the picture. And behind the horse were the handlers, the trainers who knew how to work around that damaged hoof, the grooms who fed him and cleaned his stall and wrapped that foot every day. The exercise riders who put in the miles nobody saw, the veterinarians who kept him sound enough to race, the machine that turned a flawed colt into a national champion. Assault got the crown, the ranch got the glory. The people who made it happen, most of their names aren't in the history books. Chapter 11. Middle Ground and the Working Horses. 4 years later, it happened again, 1950. Another King Ranch horse, another shot at the biggest prizes in American racing. Mid-Ground wasn't a Triple Crown winner. The Preakness slipped away, lost to a horse named Hill Prince by a neck. But he took the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont Stakes, cementing something more valuable than a single championship, a pattern. King Ranch wasn't a ranch that got lucky once. It was a program, a system, a name that appeared at the top of racing forms with unsettling regularity. 2 Derby winners in 5 years from a cattle operation in South Texas, competing against the established thoroughbred dynasties of Kentucky and New York and Maryland. But the thoroughbreds were only half the horse story. The ranch didn't run on racehorses. It ran on quarter horses, more than 200 of them according to current company figures. Working animals, not show animals. Horses bred for the specific demands of cattle work in South Texas brush country, short bursts of speed to cut a calf from the herd, the agility to navigate mesquite thickets, the temperament to spend 10 hours in the saddle under a summer sun without breaking down. The quarter-horse program followed the same logic as the cattle breeding. Identify the traits that matter, select for them ruthlessly, cull what doesn't work, refine over generations until the animals fit the task like a key fits a lock. These weren't the horses that won trophies. These were the horses that did the actual work, the ones that carried Kineo cowboys through 800,000 acres of pasture day after day, year after year, the ones whose bloodlines were tracked just as carefully as the thoroughbreds, whose conformation was evaluated just as rigorously, whose training was just as systematic. The ranch developed its own line of quarter horses, just as it developed its own breed of cattle, Animals shaped over generations to fit a specific purpose, to thrive in a specific environment, to perform a specific job better than anything else available. Assault and Midground got the headlines. The quarter horses got up before dawn and didn't come back until dark. This is how brands become dynasties, not through single victories, but through repetition, through the expectation that excellence isn't an accident, it's infrastructure, through the understanding that a name should mean something consistent, reliable, worth paying attention to every time it appears. By the early 1950s, the ranch's reputation had calcified into something almost mythological. Santa Gertrudis cattle being exported to ranches around the world, Derby winners and Triple Crown champions, working horses that other ranches tried to buy and couldn't, oil wells pumping quietly in the background, conservation programs earning praise from wildlife agencies. The running W wasn't just a brand anymore. It was a symbol of Texas, of success, of a certain kind of American ambition that built empires out of brushland and called it progress. But symbols have a way of concealing as much as they reveal. Chapter 12. Wildlife as Management, 1945. The ranch hires a wildlife biologist. His name was Val Lehman. His job was to study the animals that were not cattle, the deer and the quail and the turkey and the hundreds of species that shared 800,000 acres with the livestock operation. To understand them, to manage them, to turn them into something the ranch could use. This was unusual for the time. In 1945, most ranches treated wildlife as either a nuisance or a resource to be extracted without limits. Predators were shot on sight. Game was hunted whenever and however the landowner chose. Habitat was whatever was left after the cattle got what they needed. King Ranch did something different. It invested in understanding. Over the decades that followed, the ranch became known for its wildlife management. Quail populations were tracked and protected, their habitat maintained even when it conflicted with grazing pressure. Deer herds were managed for quality rather than just quantity, culling the weak, protecting the strong, shaping the population toward the trophy animals that hunters would pay top dollar to pursue. The numbers grew impressive. More than 370 bird species have been documented on ranch land, an almost inconceivable diversity for a working cattle operation. Conservation organizations designated parts of it an important bird area, a recognition usually reserved for public preserves, not private ranches. The running W became associated not just with cattle, but with stewardship. And then there were the Nilgai. In the late 1920s, someone decided that the ranch needed something exotic. Nilgai antelope, large blue-gray animals native to the Indian subcontinent, were obtained from zoo stock and released onto King Ranch land. They thrived. The South Texas brush turned out to be remarkably similar to their native habitat. They multiplied, spread beyond ranch boundaries, became one of the signature species of the entire region. Today, nilgai roam across much of South Texas, a permanent addition to the landscape, courtesy of a decision made nearly a century ago. You can hunt nilgai on King Ranch land. You can pay substantial fees to pursue an animal that would not exist in Texas at all if someone had not decided to put it there. The exotic becomes the authentic, the introduced becomes the native, and the cash register keeps ringing. Is that conservation, or is it curation, the deliberate creation of a landscape that serves human interests and calls itself natural? The wildlife programs are real. The habitat protection matters. The research conducted by ranch biologists has contributed genuine knowledge about South Texas ecosystems, but conservation on private land always serves the landowner first. The quail are managed because hunters will pay to shoot them. The deer are protected because trophy fees are lucrative. The nilgai exist because someone wanted exotic animals to hunt, and they turned out to be profitable. The hunting operations have become a significant revenue stream. Wealthy clients from around the world pay premium prices for guided hunts on King Ranch land. They sleep in comfortable lodges. They eat meals prepared by professional staff. They are driven to blinds and stands where the wildlife has been managed to maximize their chances of taking home a trophy. The economics are straightforward. A trophy white-tailed deer hunt can cost thousands of dollars. A nilgai hunt, the exotic antelope that someone's great-grandfather imported from a zoo, can cost even more. Quail hunting, conducted in the traditional style with dogs and guides, attracts a clientele that expects to pay for exclusivity. The wildlife is not just tolerated anymore, it is cultivated, managed, monetized. The same systematic thinking that created the Santa Gertrudis cattle now shapes the deer herd, the quail population, the exotic species that roam the brush. Stewardship and control aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing, wearing different hats. And sometimes conservation is just another word for monetizing what you own. Chapter 13. King Ranch Bluestem. Good intentions don't always stay good. Sometime in the mid-20th century, the exact date is debated, the details lost in the haze of routine agricultural decisions. A grass called King Ranch Bluestem was introduced to South Texas. The logic made sense. The native grasses were struggling. Decades of overgrazing had weakened them. Drought cycles had killed them off. Brush encroachment had crowded them out. The pastures needed something hardier, something that could establish quickly and hold soil in place and provide forage when the native species failed. King Ranch Bluestem delivered on every one of those promises. It grew where other grasses failed. It established quickly, spreading from planted areas into bare ground with aggressive efficiency. It held soil in place during the kind of heavy rains that used to wash topsoil into the Gulf of Mexico. It also didn't stop. The grass spread beyond pastures, beyond ranch boundaries, into roadsides and vacant lots and natural areas where it had never been planted and wasn't wanted. It formed dense monocultures, stands of a single species, crowding out everything else, simplifying ecosystems that had evolved over millennia into something monotonous and impoverished. Wildlife that depended on diverse plant communities found their habitat transformed. Quail need patches of bare ground between grass clumps to forage and move. King Ranch. Bluestem grows too thick, too uniform, eliminating the mosaic they require. Grassland birds need native seed heads for food. King Ranch. Bluestem crowds them out, replacing diversity with monotony. The very wildlife programs the ranch prided itself on were being undermined by a grass the ranch had helped spread. Today, King Ranch Bluestem is recognized as an invasive species in parts of Texas. Land managers, including, ironically, some who work for King Ranch, spend significant resources trying to control it. The grass that was supposed to solve a problem became a problem itself, spreading far beyond the pastures where it was planted, into roadsides and rights-of-way and nature preserves that never asked for it. This isn't a story about villainy. Nobody introduced the grass hoping it would damage ecosystems. The ranchers who planted it were trying to save their pastures, not destroy someone else's nature preserves. They were solving the problem in front of them with the tools available to them, same as anyone would. But that's precisely the point. Systems scaled to 800,000 acres have consequences scaled to 800,000 acres. When you operate at that size, your solutions become other people's problems. Your improvements become the baseline that everyone else has to adapt to. Your decisions echo through ecosystems for decades after you've stopped thinking about them. King Ranch didn't invent industrial agriculture. It didn't create the economic pressures that made introduced species seem necessary. It was just big enough and successful enough that its choices carried further than most. The grass still grows. The brand still shines. And somewhere in the gap between them is a question nobody at the ranch has to answer, because the consequences landed somewhere else. Chapter 14. The Modern Footprint. What is King Ranch today? The numbers still impress. According to the company, the ranch is home to approximately 35,000 cattle and more than 200 quarter horses. The original Texas property remains largely intact, 825,000 acres across those same 6 counties where the whole thing started. But the operation has spread beyond Texas. Florida farmland, thousands of acres of it, extends the company's agricultural reach into citrus, row crops, and turf grass. Land acquired when South Texas seemed too risky to bet everything on, when diversification meant survival, when spreading across multiple states meant that no single drought or market crash could bring the whole thing down. The Florida operations look nothing like the Texas ranch. No brush country, no running W cattle grazing in the mesquite, just farmland managed for yield, contributing to a bottom line that no longer depends on any single product or any single piece of geography. Cattle aren't the whole story anymore. Maybe they never were, once the oil started flowing. The modern King Ranch is a diversified agribusiness conglomerate. Citrus groves in South Texas, row crops in Florida, turf grass operations supplying sod to landscaping companies, hunting leases that bring wealthy clients from around the world, ecotourism for visitors who want to see the history without shooting anything, retail merchandise bearing the running W, leather goods, clothing, accessories, and then there's Ford. In the year 2000, King Ranch licensed its name to Ford Motor Company for a special edition truck package, leather seats with the running W embossed into the headrests, premium trim, a nameplate on the tailgate that says King Ranch in a font designed to evoke heritage and authenticity. The ranch itself runs on approximately 260 Ford trucks, or so the company states. The licensing deal turned a working relationship into a consumer brand. Now you can buy King Ranch without ever setting foot in Texas, without ever seeing a cow, without ever knowing that the symbol on your dashboard represents a century and a half of water management, labor systems, genetic engineering, oil extraction, and ecological transformation. The King Ranch Ford has become one of the best-selling special edition trucks in America. Consumers pay premium prices for leather seats and a nameplate. They're not buying a truck. They're buying an association, a connection to something that feels authentic, feels rooted, feels real in a way that most consumer products don't. The brand has become untethered from the operation. This isn't unique to King Ranch. It's the trajectory of every successful American enterprise. You start by making something, cattle in this case, and later horses and oil and crops. You end by meaning something. The making becomes secondary to the meaning, and the meaning can be sold to anyone, anywhere, for anything. A truck isn't a ranch. A belt buckle isn't a breeding program. A gift shop isn't a fence line stretching to the horizon, but they all carry the same brand. And the brand is what survives. Chapter 15. Historic Landmark, 1961. The National Park Service designates King Ranch a National Historic Landmark. Think about what that means. A working ranch, a private business, still operating, still generating profit, still very much in the hands of the families that have always controlled it, receives the same federal recognition given to battlefields and monuments and places where history is supposed to be preserved for the public good. The designation wasn't unearned. The ranch had genuinely shaped the American cattle industry. The Santa Gertrudis breed was a real innovation with real global impact. The scale of the operation, continuous ownership of more than 800,000 acres for more than a century, was historically significant by any measure. A separate listing on the National Register of Historic Places formalized the recognition further. Layer upon layer of official acknowledgement, building a wall of legitimacy around the operation. The ranch had become a museum that was still a business, a monument that was still making money, a piece of the past that was very much alive in the present, protected by the same federal government that had once struggled to impose any authority on this corner of Texas. But landmark status does something more than recognize the past. It protects the future. A National Historic Landmark carries weight. It confers legitimacy that money can't buy directly. It wraps private property in the language of public heritage, making it harder to criticize, harder to regulate, harder to question. When the government itself declares that your business is part of the national story, who gets to argue? The ranch isn't just a business anymore. It's an institution, part of the cultural patrimony of the United States, protected not just by fences and lawyers, but by something more powerful, the collective agreement that this place matters, that it represents something worth preserving, that questioning it means questioning America itself. And maybe it does matter. Historic preservation isn't a conspiracy. The ranch is genuinely significant. The architecture, the records, the continuity of operation across more than 170 years, these things have value. They deserve to be documented and protected. But significance isn't neutral. It's chosen. Someone decides what gets preserved and what gets forgotten. Someone decides whose story the landmark tells and whose story gets left out of the nomination paperwork. The King Ranch that became a landmark is the King Ranch of innovation and endurance, the cattle breed, the horse program, the founding family's vision, the continuous operation through wars and depressions and transformations that destroyed lesser enterprises. The King Ranch that doesn't appear on the landmark plaque is the one built by Los Kineos, the one funded by oil royalties, the one that introduced invasive grasses and exotic game animals, the one that accumulated land during a period when accumulation meant displacement of indigenous people, of Mexican landowners, of small ranchers who couldn't compete with an operation this well capitalized. History doesn't preserve itself. It gets curated, and King Ranch has always understood that better than most. Chapter 16. Legend or Blueprint. So what have we been looking at? Start with water. A creek in the desert, claimed early, held tight. Then wells drilled 500 feet into the earth, pulling up water that took centuries to accumulate, creating an infrastructure of control that freed the operation from the surface and made expansion possible in every direction. Control of water became control of land. Control of land became control of everything that needed land to survive. Add labor. Families who arrived in desperation and stayed for generations. Workers who built the fences and worked the cattle and maintained the wells and broke the horses, whose names mostly didn't make it into the history books, whose loyalty or dependency kept the machine running for 170 years while the founders got the credit and the monuments. Add biology. Decades of controlled breeding, shaping animals into products that could survive where other products failed. Tick eradication campaigns, nutrition programs, the reduction of livestock to inventory, managed with the precision of a factory, optimized for output rather than any consideration of what the animals themselves might want. Add infrastructure. Fences that enclosed 800,000 acres, divided into 4 divisions, subdivided into hundreds of pastures, each one mapped and scheduled and optimized. Root plows that cleared the brush. Introduced grasses that solved one problem and created another. The systematic conversion of wild land into productive land, with all the costs that conversion carries, costs paid by ecosystems and species that didn't have a voice in the decision. Add money. Cattle margins that barely broke even until oil changed everything. 650 wells pumping wealth out of the ground, funding prestige projects and conservation programs and brand expansions that would have been impossible on beef alone. The transformation of a working ranch into an investment vehicle with excellent public relations. Add prestige. Racehorses with triple crowns. Working horses bred for generations. Wildlife programs with professional biologists, historic landmark status from the federal government, the conversion of a business into a symbol and a symbol into something that couldn't be questioned without seeming unpatriotic. Add regional power. A town built at the edge of the ranch, a county named for a family connected to the operation, an economy that revolves around a single enterprise decade after decade, until the distinction between private interest and public good disappears entirely. Add brand. The running W, registered February 9th, 1869, still appearing on cattle and trucks and leather goods and gift shop merchandise more than 150 years later. A mark that outlived every man who ever wore it. A story that kept being told long after the people who started it were gone. That's the machine, water, labor, biology, infrastructure, money, prestige, regional power, brand, each piece feeding the next, each piece making the next one possible. Each piece locked into a system so complete, so self-reinforcing, that it stopped looking like a system at all. It just looked like Texas, like the frontier, like the way things were supposed to be. But systems don't build themselves. Someone makes choices. Someone benefits. Someone pays costs that don't show up on the balance sheet and don't get mentioned in the press releases. The land that became King Ranch was someone else's land first. The labor that built it came from people who didn't have many other options. The water that sustained it was drawn from aquifers that may not refill for generations. The grasses that covered it are still spreading into places they were never meant to go. None of this makes King Ranch unique. Every large operation has a shadow. Every success story has costs that someone else paid. Every brand that shines bright enough to see from a distance is casting shadows you can't see from where you're standing. What makes King Ranch significant is the scale and the clarity. 825,000 acres is large enough to see the pattern. 170 years is long enough to trace the consequences. 4 divisions, 35,000 cattle, 200 horses, 650 oil wells, more than 370 bird species, 1 breed of cattle that changed an industry. The numbers are large enough to matter, documented enough to verify, persistent enough to mean something. The brand is famous enough that the questions matter. This isn't an indictment. It's not an endorsement either. It's just a question. The same question we started with, the same question the cold open asked, the same question that echoes through every chapter of this story. When you look at King Ranch, what do you see? A survival story? Families who came to the desert with nothing and built something that lasted against all odds? A testament to grit and vision and the willingness to adapt when the world changed around them? Or a blueprint? A template for how private power accumulates and protects itself across generations? A case study in how land becomes leverage, leverage becomes wealth, wealth becomes prestige, and prestige becomes armor against accountability? The ranch doesn't answer that question. It doesn't have to. It just keeps running, like it has for 170 years, like it probably will for 170 more. The machine doesn't explain itself. The machine just continues. The running W is still there, on the gates, on the cattle, on the trucks driving down roads that didn't exist when the first stake went into the ground beside Santa Gertrudis Creek. A brand that outlived the men who made it. A symbol that became more powerful than the reality it represents. A machine that looks like a legend. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe legend and blueprint were never opposites. Maybe they're the same thing, just seen from different sides of the fence. Which side you're standing on determines what you see. And the fence stretches all the way to the horizon in every direction for 825,000 acres.